There is a sentence that has haunted scouts, executives, and analysts for 40 years. 7 words spoken into a microphone the night of June 19, 1984, by a man who had just made the 3rd pick in the NBA draft. 7 words that, the moment they left his mouth, became the most expensive mistake in the history of professional basketball. Not because the man who said them was stupid, not because he was malicious, but because he looked at Michael Jeffrey Jordan, 21 years old, 6 feet 6 inches of pure fury and fire, and decided with complete confidence that what he was seeing was ordinary. Jordan isn't going to turn this franchise around. That was the sentence. And if you want to understand how those 7 words ended up costing every single team in the NBA, except one, the next decade of their existence, then you need to travel back to a world where the sky over basketball was ruled by giants, and a kid from North Carolina was about to change everything anyone thought they knew about the game. Before we get to the draft room, before we get to the press conference and the apology and the 7 words, we need to spend some time in the world that produced them. Because the story of the 1984 draft is not ultimately a story about one bad prediction. It is a story about an entire belief system, carefully constructed, historically grounded, widely shared, and completely, catastrophically wrong. The NBA in 1984 was a different planet, not just different in style or rules or strategy, different in its deepest convictions about what greatness looked like and where it came from. The league had been built on the backs of giants, in the most literal sense of the word. Bill Russell, 6 feet 9, rewriting the game with 11 championship rings and a presence in the paint so suffocating that opposing offenses would reorganize themselves around the simple problem of not having to go near him. Wilt Chamberlain, 7 feet 1, scoring 100 points in a single night, as if the rulebook was merely a suggestion written by people who hadn't yet encountered him. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, 7 feet 2, with a skyhook so geometrically perfect that it looked like it had been designed by a mathematician who had never seen a basketball, but understood angles and trajectories better than any defender who would ever try to stop it. And most recently, Moses Malone, hulking and relentless and possessed of a physical aggression that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than basketball, leading the Philadelphia 76ers to a championship in 1983 with a postseason run so dominant that he had announced it beforehand with a phrase that became instantly legendary: "Foe, foe, foe." 4 wins in 4 games in each playoff round. He nearly delivered. And his performance reinforced what 30 years of NBA history had already established as something close to gospel. If you wanted to win, you needed a mountain in the middle. Height was destiny. Size was salvation. Everything else, the speed, the shooting touch, the court vision, the extraordinary athleticism that could lift a smaller man above the rim as if gravity were a rule for other people, all of that was impressive, entertaining, worth the price of admission, but ultimately insufficient. The lesson that every general manager, every scout, every basketball mind had absorbed was simple, almost biological. You build around the center. The shooting guard is the supporting character. The center is the story. Into this world walked Michael Jordan, and the universe was not ready for him. He had just spent 3 years playing for Dean Smith at the University of North Carolina, a program so disciplined, so system-dependent, so deliberately designed to suppress individual brilliance in service of collective excellence, that even the people who watched him every night couldn't fully see what was there. Smith's philosophy was elegant, and for the purposes of player evaluation, deeply maddening. The ball moved, the players moved, the system hummed along with the efficiency of a well-maintained machine, and no single name was permitted to rise above it. You ran the play, you passed to the open man, you trusted the system, and the system, in return, made you a better player, and made it nearly impossible for anyone outside Chapel Hill to understand exactly how good you were as an individual. Jordan averaged a respectable 17.7 points per game in his final college season, was named National Player of the Year by several bodies, and had hit the game-winning shot in the 1982 NCAA championship as a freshman, a moment so cinematic, with the clock ticking and the stakes absolute, and the ball leaving his hands in an arc that seemed to understand what it needed to do, that it almost seemed invented after the fact. But in a league obsessed with 7-foot shadows, a 6'6" guard playing in a disciplined team system was easy to misread, easy to underestimate, easy to file away in the category of very good rather than once in a generation. The measurements were accurate, the tape existed, the games were on record, and yet the framework through which every scout interpreted what they saw was built on assumptions that Jordan had not been designed to satisfy. He was not going to beat you with size. He was going to beat you with something that had no column in any scouting spreadsheet, something that even the smartest evaluators in the sport would struggle to describe afterward, something that you could only fully understand by watching it operate night after night, against the best competition the world could provide. The 1984 NBA draft was held at the Felt Forum inside Madison Square Garden on June 19th. 23 teams had representatives in the building, or executives connected by phone to quiet rooms across America, all of them hunched over notebooks thick with measurements, projections, injury histories, psychological evaluations, and the accumulated conventional wisdom of decades of scouting. The consensus at the top of the board was clear and uncontested. Akeem Olajuwon, not yet Hakeem, the H would come later as part of his conversion to Islam, was the prize. 7 feet tall, fluid beyond anything that should be possible for a man his size, a Nigerian-born center from the University of Houston who moved like water and defended like a wall and had arrived in America with essentially no formal basketball training and had in the span of a few years become the most coveted prospect in the sport. The Houston Rockets had the first pick. The selection of Olajuwon was not a decision that required deliberation. It was an inevitability that everyone had already accepted weeks before June 19th arrived. The second pick belonged to the Portland Trail Blazers. And here is where the story begins to twist in ways that still make basketball historians wince and look away and then look back, unable to stop themselves. Portland had a structural problem. They already had a shooting guard. Not just any shooting guard, a young, athletic, electrifying shooting guard named Clyde Drexler, whom they had selected in 1983 and who showed every sign of becoming a legitimate star. A player who would eventually be inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame and remembered as one of the finest of his era. The conventional wisdom said that you don't draft another guard when you already have a good one. You address the need, you fill the hole. And Portland's hole was in the front court. So Portland's director of personnel, Stu Inman, a man widely respected throughout the league as a basketball genius, a savvy evaluator with a deep understanding of the game, turned his eyes toward a 7'1" center from the University of Kentucky named Sam Bowie. Bowie was talented, Bowie was projectable, and Bowie had missed 2 of his last 3 college seasons due to leg injuries, a detail that, in hindsight, screams from the page like a fire alarm that everyone in the building had agreed, without quite discussing it, to ignore. Portland drafted Sam Bowie with the 2nd overall pick. Michael Jordan was still on the board, waiting, quietly. The Chicago Bulls held the 3rd selection, and their general manager, Rod Thorne, found himself in the position that every executive secretly dreams of and publicly dreads, holding a pick that could define a franchise in a room full of competing pressures and a roster full of losing seasons. The Bulls had won only 27 games the previous year. The city of Chicago was hungry in the way that cities get hungry after too many winters without a winner. Not just wanting to win, but needing it. The way you need warmth after you've been cold for a very long time. The ownership wanted a big man, a center, a power forward, something that fit the established template of what champions were supposed to look like and be built around. Thorne had watched tape of Jordan in Dean Smith's office in Chapel Hill months before the draft. He had sat with the coach and studied the footage and come away impressed. But impressed and certain are different emotional states, and in 1984, certainty required 7 feet. He went back to Chicago thinking Jordan was probably his man, but carrying, as executives always carry, the nagging question of what he might be missing. The night of the draft, something unusual happened in the Conrad Hilton Ballroom in Chicago, where Bulls fans had gathered to watch the selection on television. As the picks ticked by, Olajuwon to Houston, Bowie to Portland, the crowd grew restless, then louder. then electric with a specific kind of anticipation. When the Bulls' turn came, a chant rose from the floor. "Jordan, Jordan!" Loud enough, one reporter noted, to be heard 2 floors above where management was deliberating. Not that anyone up there was particularly listening to the chants from downstairs. When the pick was announced, Michael Jordan, shooting guard, University of North Carolina, there was celebration in the ballroom, strangers embracing, beer spilling, the specific joy of a city that had been waiting for something and had just heard a name that felt like the start of a new chapter. But in the front office, the mood was different, more measured, more cautious, more peculiarly apologetic. Rod Thorne faced the cameras that evening and said what he genuinely believed. In the measured tones of a man being honest about his own uncertainty, "We wish he were 7 feet, but he isn't. There just wasn't a center available. What can you do? Jordan isn't going to turn this franchise around. I wouldn't ask him to. I wouldn't put that kind of pressure on him. He's a very good offensive player, but not an overpowering offensive player." The Chicago Tribune published the story the following morning under a headline that would become one of the most darkly ironic in sports journalism history. "Apologetic Bulls stuck with Michael Jordan." The reporter noted that the Bulls had tried to avoid Jordan, tried hard, that nobody wanted to trade with them, that they were, in his memorable phrase, forced to do the intelligent thing. Stuck, that was the word. The organization that had just selected the greatest basketball player who would ever live described itself as stuck, forced into something, a reluctant recipient of what the universe had decided to give them. And across the league, in 17 other front offices, there were men who read that story or heard about it and nodded along with a private relief that they had not been burdened with the same situation. Nobody wanted to be stuck with Michael Jordan. Within 18 months, every single one of them would have traded their entire roster for the chance to be that stuck. But here is the detail that gets lost in the rush to recount the draft itself, the detail that shifts the whole narrative from a simple tale of scouting error into something far more layered and strange. Rod Thorne was not expressing a personal quirk or an eccentric opinion. He was echoing a chorus made up of some of the most credentialed voices in professional basketball. One of those voices belonged to Walt Clyde Frazier, 2-time NBA champion, 7-time All-Star, New York Knicks legend. A man who had played at the highest level of the game for over a decade, who understood it in his bones and his sinew, who had shared a court with Wilt Chamberlain and faced the Boston Celtics dynasty in its prime. Frazier looked at Michael Jordan in 1984 and said with the easy confidence of a man who has no reason to doubt his own judgment, "Michael's got to realize he's not 7 foot, so he's not going to carry a team in the NBA." The full quote, as it would later be captured on film and broadcast to a stunned audience in the 2020 documentary The Last Dance, added, "I think he will be a great addition to the Bulls and should draw fans to the game, but it takes more than one guy to win games." That sentence, "it takes more than one guy," did not age well for Walt Frazier. In fairness, he said it in a world where it had always been true. He couldn't have known he was talking about the one guy for whom the rule would have to be reconsidered. Another voice in the chorus belonged to Mark Eaton, the 7'4" Utah Jazz center, who had spent years mastering the art of defensive presence. Eaton echoed the sentiment entirely. A 6'6" guard, however gifted, was not the kind of player you built a franchise around. These were not fringe opinions. They were not outliers or cranks or contrarians performing skepticism for attention. They were the accumulated wisdom of the sport, filtered through the experience of men who had lived inside it for decades, applied with genuine confidence to a young man who had not yet had the opportunity to dismantle everything they believed. And they were about to be made completely, permanently, irreversibly obsolete. Training camp started, and within 48 hours something shifted in the air at Engelman Gymnasium in Chicago. Not gradually, not in the cautious, incremental way that talent usually reveals itself over weeks of practice and evaluation, immediately, viscerally, undeniably. Veterans who had been in the league for a decade found themselves stopping mid-drill to watch what was happening a few feet away. Coaches abandoned their clipboards and their organized session plans. The other players, men who had their own professional pride and their own sense of where they stood in the hierarchy of the sport, began to understand that the hierarchy was being quietly reorganized by the presence of this one person. An assistant coach, unable to contain what he was witnessing, reportedly called Rod Thorne upstairs. The words were simple and carried the specific relief of someone who has spent months worrying about a decision and has just discovered that the worry was entirely unnecessary. Congratulations, you did not mess this draft up. October 26, 1984. Chicago Stadium. The Bulls' home opener against the Washington Bullets. 13,913 fans in the building, not a sellout, not even close. Because the city had seen too many losing seasons to give itself over to hope before seeing something that warranted it. Jordan walked onto that floor in his number 23 jersey, 21 years old, and the building hummed with the particular electricity of a crowd that suspects, without yet being certain, that it is watching the beginning of something. He scored 16 points, grabbed 6 rebounds, distributed 7 assists, stole the ball twice, blocked 4 shots. The Bulls won 109-93, a solid debut. Not a revelation, not yet, but the opening paragraph of a very long story. The paragraphs that followed arrived quickly. In just his 9th NBA game, 3 weeks into his first season, Jordan scored 45 points against the San Antonio Spurs and grabbed 10 rebounds. The sports pages began to change their language. By November, Larry Bird, who was not in the habit of offering casual compliments, who dissected opponents with the clinical detachment of someone who understood the game at a level that made observation feel like diagnosis, said that Michael Jordan reminded him of Julius Erving. That was Bird, the most respected player in the sport, telling the world that something categorically different was happening in Chicago. Arena by arena, city by city, the word was spreading in a way that defied the normal mechanisms of sports journalism. You couldn't fully explain it in a box score. You couldn't reduce it to a stat line. Coaches held extra film sessions not to study their own rosters, but to try to understand what exactly they were watching when the tape showed a 6'6" guard doing things the tape was not supposed to show. By February of 1985, when the All-Star Weekend came to Indianapolis, Michael Jordan was not merely a promising rookie, he was the attraction. The NBA Slam Dunk Contest became something else entirely the moment he stepped onto the floor. He took off from the free throw line, 15 feet from the basket, a distance that the human body should not be able to bridge in a single airborne motion, while maintaining the control and grace and intention of someone who knows exactly what he is doing, and floated. There is no other word. Floated. Somewhere in that arc, between the takeoff and the arrival, his body seemed to disobey a law that everyone in the building had until that moment accepted as non-negotiable. The crowd went silent before it went loud. Silent first because the mind needs a moment to reconcile what it has just witnessed with what it believed was possible. Then loud, very loud, the way crowds get loud when they understand they are watching something they will describe to people for the rest of their lives. By the end of that rookie season, Jordan had averaged 28.2 points per game, shooting over 51% from the field, adding 6.5 rebounds, 5.9 assists, and 2.4 steals per night. He was the Rookie of the Year by unanimous vote. He had led the Bulls from 27 wins to 38 wins and a return to the playoffs for the first time since 1981. He had set franchise records for points, field goals, free throws, and steals in a single season. He had done it in his first year, and the 7 words were getting more expensive by the game. Now stop. Because here is where the story takes a turn that most people know about, but fewer people have fully felt. The 1985-86 season opened with the promise that the first year had generated, and then 57 games in, it shattered. Jordan broke a bone in his left foot. He missed most of the season. The Bulls fell to 30 wins. In basketball circles, very quietly, almost apologetically, the whispers returned. Maybe they had been right all along. Maybe a shooting guard built on speed and explosion and airtime was structurally fragile in ways that a center built for the paint was not. Maybe the foot was not an accident, but a sign of a vulnerability built into the model. And then Jordan came back. He returned for the final 15 games of the season against the explicit preference of team management, who wanted him to rest for the following year. He did not rest. The Bulls barely qualified for the playoffs, a sixth seed with a 30-52 record, and faced the Boston Celtics in the first round. The Celtics were the best team in basketball that year. They would go on to win the championship. Bird and Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish had constructed a team so deep and balanced that it seemed to have no viable weakness. Jordan played anyway. In Game 2 of that series, on the Celtics' home floor in Boston, Michael Jordan scored 63 points. 63. Against the best team in the sport, coming off a broken foot. As a 23-year-old in only his second professional season, the Celtics won the game in double overtime. They swept the series. None of that in the long accounting of what mattered changed what had happened. After the game, Larry Bird sat before the cameras and said something that has been repeated so many times since that it risks becoming familiar. That was God disguised as Michael Jordan. He said it flatly, as a description of what he had witnessed, not as metaphor or hyperbole. God, disguised as Michael Jordan. The franchise that wasn't going to be turned around had just scored 63 points against the best team in the league in the playoffs on a broken foot. What happened over the next 4 years is a chapter of frustration and bitter, grinding education that tends to get compressed in memory because of what came after, but which was, in its own way, as definitional as anything Jordan ever achieved in June against the best teams in the world. The Detroit Pistons stood between Chicago and everything. Bill Laimbeer, hard and calculating and completely unbothered by the opinion of anyone who found his methods unsportsmanlike. Dennis Rodman, relentless in a way that went beyond strategy into something closer to complete physical dedication, willing to devote every ounce of his energy to making life miserable for the man he was guarding. Isaiah Thomas, brilliant and cold, and capable of organizing the people around him into a collective instrument of domination, and a defensive scheme designed specifically, deliberately, surgically, to destroy Michael Jordan. They called it the Jordan rules. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Send 2 bodies at him every time he touched the ball, hit him when he drives, hit him when he shoots, hit him when he lands, hit him in every legal and semi-legal way the rulebook permitted, and trust that even supernatural talent has a physical ceiling that sustained punishment can eventually locate. For 3 consecutive years, 1988, 1989, the Pistons eliminated the Bulls in the playoffs. 3 years of watching Detroit celebrate while Chicago walked off the floor. 3 years of a question growing louder. Is Jordan enough? Can one man, however gifted and driven, actually win a championship when the league has organized itself around stopping him? The whispers had begun in 1984 as a conversation about size. By 1989, they had evolved into a conversation about something harder to measure, about whether there was a quality beyond individual greatness that championships required, and whether Jordan possessed it or would ever acquire it. Walt Frazier, watching, admitted years later that even during those Pistons years he remained uncertain. The pattern of Jordan's brilliance was undeniable. But the pattern of Jordan's playoff exits was there too, every spring, reminding the skeptics that they had not been entirely wrong. And then everything changed. Phil Jackson arrived with a triangle offense that distributed the creative burden across 5 players. Scottie Pippen emerged as a second star of genuine and extraordinary quality. A player of such versatility and defensive intelligence that he gave Jordan the partnership the Pistons had been able to deny him by simply doubling him whenever he touched the ball. The roster improved around them. And in 1991, the Bulls met the Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals and dismantled them without ceremony. When the final seconds ticked down and the Pistons began walking off the floor before the buzzer had sounded, in an act of collective petulance that Jordan watched and filed away and never forgot, the era had officially changed. The Bulls won the championship in 1991. They won it again in 1992, they won it again in 1993. 3 consecutive titles. A dynasty built on a foundation that the league's own general managers had described, on the record, as insufficient. built by a player that the consensus of professional basketball had concluded, in June of 1984, was a very good offensive player, but not an overpowering one. When the final buzzer sounded in the 1993 NBA Finals and Jordan collapsed to the floor of the arena in Phoenix, clutching the basketball, overwhelmed by something that went far beyond basketball, thinking about his father James, who had been murdered that summer, the grief compressed into this moment of completion. Every word ever spoken about his limitations was answered, not with a speech, with a basketball in his hands and the weight of 3 championships settled around him, and then the plot twist. The moment that no screenwriter could have invented and no forecasting model could have anticipated. In October of 1993, Michael Jordan retired, not because of injury, not because the competition had ground him down. He walked away because his father was dead, and the challenge of basketball no longer felt proportionate to what he was carrying as a human being. He went to play minor league baseball in the Chicago White Sox organization, and for 16 months the NBA continued without him. Games were played, other stars performed, championships were contested, but something textural was absent. Something that could not be named with precision and could not be replaced at any price. Television ratings declined. Arenas that had been selling out for Bulls road games for nearly a decade settled back into their older patterns. The sport was smaller without him than anyone had realized it had become because of him. He came back, March 18, 1995, in a press release that was 2 words long. "I'm back." Within hours, the entire infrastructure of the sport reorganized itself around those 2 words. Jordan returned for the final 18 games of that season, played well but unevenly, still reconnecting with the muscle memory of being the best basketball player alive. The Orlando Magic eliminated the Bulls in the playoffs that year. There were people, always there are people, who suggested that maybe the sabbatical had taken something that couldn't be recovered. Maybe 32 was 32, and even Michael Jordan was subject to the mathematics of time. The following year, the Bulls went 72-10, the best regular season record in NBA history. Jordan won the scoring title, the Most Valuable Player award, the Finals MVP, and the championship. The year after that, they won again. The year after that, they won again. Another three-peat. 6 championships in 8 seasons, 10 scoring titles, 5 MVP awards, 6 Finals MVP awards. The numbers accumulated with the steady, remorseless precision of a ledger being settled, an accounting conducted night after night, season after season, the balance always moving in the same direction. When Rod Thorne, watching from a distance, was asked in interviews how he felt about the man he had drafted and described as insufficient, he answered with the most honest words available to him. "I thought he'll come in and play and help us. But to think that he would be what he turned out to be? No way, no way, no way. From the man who drafted him. No way from the man who had called himself stuck, and in doing so had become a figure of historical irony so complete and so permanent that no amount of subsequent career accomplishment could fully dissolve it. Because history, when it decides to make a point, makes it absolutely. And now here is the part of the story that reaches across everything and touches you directly. Not as a basketball fan, as a person, as someone who has been in that room, not a draft room maybe, but a room of some kind, a conversation, a performance review, a meeting with someone whose opinion you respected too much to entirely dismiss, where someone looked at what you were building or becoming and offered you their expert assessment that it wasn't the kind of thing that turned franchises around. Maybe they used kind words. Maybe they dressed the doubt in the language of experience and realism and genuine concern for your well-being. But beneath the softening, the message was familiar. This is very good, but not overpowering. We wish you were 7 feet tall. Jordan isn't going to turn this franchise around. Rod Thorne was not a cruel man. Walt Frazier was not a stupid one. The scouts and executives and analysts who let Jordan slide to the 3rd pick were not operating in bad faith. They were applying the best tools available to them, filtered through assumptions so deeply embedded in the culture of their world that questioning them felt less like reconsidering a theory and more like questioning the rules of arithmetic. That is how belief systems operate. That is how consensus calcifies into conviction. That is how rooms full of intelligent people agree on things that history will eventually find hilarious or devastating, or both. The difference between Michael Jordan and everyone else in that draft class, and by extension, the difference between the person who turns a franchise around and the person who is content to be a solid contributor, was not merely physical talent, though the talent was extraordinary. It was not merely competitive desire, though the desire burned with an intensity that people who encountered it up close sometimes described as frightening. It was something subtler and harder to name, the absolute, non-negotiable refusal to allow someone else's limited imagination to serve as the ceiling of his own possibility. He could not be filed away. He could not be satisfactorily categorized. He could be underestimated. He was, repeatedly, by people who should have known better. But every underestimation only added another entry to the cabinet he kept locked, the inventory of doubt that he would eventually convert, with perfect and systematic efficiency, into 6 championships and a global transformation of a sport that thought it already understood the limits of its own possibilities. You have been there, somewhere quieter than an NBA draft room, with stakes calibrated differently, but in the same essential situation. Someone has stood in front of what you were building and handed you their verdict. And the question that Michael Jordan's entire career asks, in 63 points against the Celtics, and in 3-peats, and in a return from baseball at 32 and in a 72-win season, and in 6 championships total, is the question that this story has been building toward from the beginning. The question directed not at basketball scouts, but at every person who has ever had to decide, alone in some quiet moment, what to do with someone else's assessment of the limits of what they were capable of. What did you store in the cabinet? What did you aim at? Rod Thorne went on to a long and respected career. He assembled the 1992 Dream Team. He won a championship as a team president in New Jersey in 2003. He is remembered as a thoughtful and intelligent executive who contributed enormously to the sport across many decades. He is also remembered inescapably for 7 words, not because those words were unique. They were, as we have seen, the consensus of the sport, the conventional wisdom of an entire era, spoken by a man who was simply doing his best to articulate what he believed in front of a room full of cameras. But because the man those words were spoken about turned out to be the answer to the largest question the sport had been carrying since the first basketball was put through the first peach basket. What does the greatest player in the history of this game look like? What does he do to a franchise, to a league, to a culture, to the imagination of every kid who has ever stood in a driveway late at night with a ball, and the stubborn conviction that the ceiling someone else sees is not the ceiling that actually exists? He looks like Michael Jordan. He looks like the 3rd pick, the player who wasn't going to change anything, the man described in the newspaper of the city he was about to remake as someone the Bulls had gotten stuck with. He looks like a person who heard the verdict, stored it, and then spent the next 14 seasons providing a response so comprehensive and so overwhelming that the verdict itself became a footnote, a famous one, a cautionary one that gets taught in business schools and sports management programs and coaching clinics around the world, but a footnote nonetheless to the larger story, which was his. If this story reached you today, if something in it made you feel the weight of a verdict that was once handed to you, or made you think about the cabinets you keep and what you have locked inside them, leave a comment. Tell us the moment that landed. Tell us where you recognized yourself in the story of a 21-year-old from North Carolina who was told by the man who drafted him that he wasn't going to change anything. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the next story is already waiting, and it will find you somewhere inside your own experience of what it means to be told you are not enough. Michael Jordan heard that. He heard it from the man who drafted him, from the legends who doubted him, from the Pistons who tried to physically break him, from the years that tested everything he had built, from the baseball sabbatical and the comeback and all the questions about whether greatness had an expiration date. And every time, without exception, without public complaint, he gave the same answer. Not in words, in the work, in the game, in the life that the sport will spend the next century trying to fully understand. 6 championships, 10 scoring titles, 14 seasons. One answer, permanent. There is one more layer to this story that deserves its own space, its own careful attention, because it changes the shape of everything that came before it. When people talk about Jordan's legacy, they tend to reach for the championships first, 6 of them, as if the number alone carries sufficient weight. Then they reach for the scoring titles, the MVP awards, the finals MVPs, the records that still stand and will likely continue standing for a generation or more. All of that is true and all of it matters. But the thing that does not get said often enough, the thing that separates Jordan's story from every other story of athletic greatness that the sport has produced, is the effect he had on the people around him. Not just the players, not just the fans, not just the executives who eventually had to acknowledge what they had missed, but the culture, the entire culture of basketball, and through basketball, of sport itself, and through sport of something broader and harder to define, the culture of what a single human being is capable of when the will is absolute and the preparation is total and the patience for other people's doubt is effectively zero. The Nike contract. Consider for a moment what Michael Jordan's relationship with Nike actually means in the context of this story. He signed with the company before his rookie season in October of 1984 at a meeting organized by a marketing executive named Sonny Vaccaro, who had convinced the company to give a single player his own signature line of shoes and apparel. Something that had never been done before. Something that the established brands like Adidas and Converse thought was an overcorrection, a gamble that misunderstood the relationship between an athlete and a product. Nike was not, in 1984, a basketball company. They were a running shoe company trying to find a way into the most visible arena in American sport, and Vaccaro told them, "This kid from North Carolina is the way in. This 6'6" guard who the Bulls apologized for selecting, this very good offensive player who was not overpowering, this man who was not going to turn the franchise around, give him his own shoe and let him show you what happens." The Air Jordan line launched in 1985. It changed Nike permanently. It changed the relationship between athletes and corporations permanently. It changed the economics of professional sport permanently. And it did all of those things because the player wearing the shoe was doing every night, on every court he stepped onto, things that the vocabulary of conventional wisdom had no words for. Every arena that Jordan entered on the road during his rookie season sold faster when he was the reason people were coming. The Bulls were a 38-win team that year, not a contender, not a playoff threat, barely a 500 team in a league that rewarded excellence with attention. But when the Bulls came to your building, you sold tickets, not because of the team, because of him. Because even in 1985, even before the championships, even before the 63 points against Boston, even before the first championship ring, people understood that they were watching something that would not come again, something that needed to be witnessed before the chance was gone. That instinct, the crowd's instinct, which is almost always more accurate than the expert's assessment, was correct. The experts had their spreadsheets and their measurements and their decades of accumulated basketball knowledge. The crowd had something simpler and more reliable. They could see what was in front of them without the filter of what they had been taught to believe was possible. Think about the Pistons years through that lens. 3 consecutive playoff eliminations. 3 years of the Jordan rules applied with physical precision and collective discipline. 3 years of Jordan walking off playoff floors without the thing that he had said from the beginning was the only thing that mattered. And here is what is remarkable, what gets lost in the noise of the final outcome. He did not stop. He did not adjust his ambitions downward to fit the ceiling that the Pistons were imposing. He did not accept the verdict of the Jordan rules the way that other great players in other eras might have accepted the verdict of a defensive scheme designed specifically to neutralize them. He worked harder, he got stronger. He refined his game in the areas where the Pistons had found the gaps. His jump shot, his ability to score without penetrating, his capacity to involve his teammates when the double team came, and he returned every autumn with the same expectation that the outcome this time would be different. Not because circumstances had changed, because he had changed, because the work was continuous and the preparation was total, and the competitive desire had found, in the obstacle of the Detroit Pistons, not a reason to reconsider, but a reason to intensify. If this story made you feel something, leave it in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about the moments that shaped the greatest athletes in history, the moments behind the highlights, behind the championships, behind the public image, where the real story of greatness was quietly being written. Because behind every number Jordan put on a scoreboard, there was a verdict he had decided not to accept. And that decision, made in private, sustained across seasons, never publicly announced, is the one that the league is still paying for. Every night, in every conversation about the greatest basketball player who ever lived,